So our podcast is called SustainaPod, so we have to talk about sustainability and the environment. Just to start off, since you guys come from like pretty varied backgrounds, what does the word sustainability mean to you personally?
I'll go first. So for me, didn't have much knowledge about sustainability. Right now, I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in sustainability as well. From what I understand, I think from what I understand, I feel sustainability is a reduction in carbon emissions and trying to reach a goal where the world becomes carbon neutral. So that's what sustainability means to me.
Um, to me, to me, a sustainable world is one where individuals and organizations would be relentlessly incentivized to make decisions that ensure the well-being of future generations to the point where to make a non-sustainable decision would be socially, strategically, and financially like nonsensical. And I think that to me is what a true sustainable world will be, driven by incentive rather than legislation and regulation.
That was very well put.
Um, so sustainability, in itself, it's being able to continue like thriving and continue, I mean, okay, from a resources perspective, being able to continue being useful and being healthy for like a long period of time. Um, Obviously, in terms of like society and how we function, it's a little bit different, but it's kind of a similar goal where you're trying to make things um, last for longer and be able to continue regenerating, um, and kind of implementing practices where you are able to um, continue functioning at a at a good quality of life. I do not put this anywhere near as well as Xavier does. But yeah, essentially, like from a technical perspective, it will be it's kind of about like being able to sustain how we live and how we use the our natural resources. Um, and it's important because like if we aren't living sustainably, the end to that is us basically dying out and taking everything else with us. To put it mildly. Um, but yeah, so that's what I think sustainability is.
I wanted to go last because I fully agree with everything I knew they were going to say. But I think the main thing I have to add on is I think sustainability can't be seen as, in some ways, people see it as a regression or a zero-sum game where we have to give up a lot of our current standards of living to create the sustainable world. And whilst in some ways we can be overly greedy, I think to me, sustainability means that we can use our innovation and our technologies to create a world where we can still have our current standard of living or even better standard of living, but also leaving less of an impact or waste towards everything around us, right? So I think it's important to still be optimistic while also being an environmentalist, because I think a lot of times people sort of see it as mutually exclusive. But with the technologies we have right now, it's true that, we have to cut back for now, but in the grand scheme of things, we will have technologies that will be both sustainable and also improve standards of living. I think that's also important to recognize, I think.
I think what's also to add on is that it's while new technology is going to be crucial to the global transition, we already have instances where making sustainable transitions can bring opportunities as well as mitigate risks. So, at a corporate level or an organizational level, it's just as important to consider your sustainability risk or your climate risk, but then also identify where those climate opportunities are. And if you're a first mover into an industry by doing some kind of sustainable activity, what the sorts of benefits that that can bring, and bring companies up to speed on identifying where those opportunities are and then quantifying what the possible returns on some of those, on capitalizing on those opportunities can be. And so that's, I think, something that needs to be spoken about a lot more, is that it's not just a cost cutting game and a risk mitigation game. It really is an opportunistic environment where we can grow value without without sacrificing, as I said, without sacrificing the well-being of future generations.
You guys have some really interesting definitions of sustainability to yourselves, and I really do agree with all the points. But one question I might pose is, you guys have like a quite, I would say, idealistic way of looking at it, but do you wonder if we're necessarily running out of time, and whether innovations will happen quickly enough for it to get to a point where it makes the most sense to make the sustainable decision rather than like rely on legislation and regulation, as you said?
I think it all comes back to what Xavier sort of said, where we need incentives and regulations to help align our current economy and our current, fundamentally companies make changes and companies are driven by economy. So our current policies, regulations, and incentives need to push in that direction. And once those directions are aligned, then we can start making these larger scale changes. I think technologies come after when we know what we're trying to do. But in terms of time, I think that we can there is already a trend that we can definitely create a sustainable world, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that we're going to be able to keep everything we currently have. That's definitely true. There will be certain things that we have to lose in the process. It's just how much we're willing to lose. But eventually, I think we will be able to make this change.
I like to go forward. I don't know if regulations is the right way to approach a problem like sustainability and becoming carbon neutral eventually. I feel that I'm quite optimistic about like how good humanity is at solving pressing problems. If you go all the way back, we have always solved problems. We were like with population growth in the 1980s, 90s, some scientists had predicted that we would go extinct because of the lack of food, but then the green revolution came up due to genetically modified plants, and we were able to stave that off and provide enough food for the world to survive. uh, these like technology innovations have always kind of propelled humanity from extinctionist point of views, and I feel that would carry forward. I feel we have already seen a lot of innovation in this space, and that might have also been stifled by regulations. So if you look at nuclear energy, it was stifled by regulations for a long time. We could have possibly developed it into a form which would have taken us away from fossil fuels and reduced our dependence on them, if not for more and more regulations in that space. Other than that, I feel what's more important than regulations is defining what sustainability is, what the metrics to use it are. Because if you look at the corporations right now, Google is carbon neutral. Most big tech companies are carbon neutral, even though they are the biggest carbon emitters. So it would be interesting to know and solidify definitions industry wide, worldwide. And I feel we would have enough innovations to become sustainable as a species. I mean, you can already see carbon capture technology becoming a force that will basically make us carbon neutral in the next 10, 20 years. So I'm very optimistic.
I have like a few points to add. Firstly, on the point of technology, I agree with what George and Tanish said. I think there is so much being done in the sector already, and there's like so much technology and so many ideas that are already out there and like that are being developed. And so again, to reiterate, like it's the incentives and like trying to kind of inform people and make them see why it's actually going to be beneficial to them in the long term to be able to make like make these transitions now. And obviously at our level we're kind of a little bit removed from it because we don't have access to like these corporations who are the ones who would be implementing like greener technologies. But like that's kind of the goal, is like you want to try and be in a position to be able to make those incentives and kind of propel the sector towards more sustainable practices. Tanish made a really good point about the definition of sustainability. Obviously, the four of us came up with four very different definitions, and that definition is different with like for literally everyone. I actually wrote about this recently, about the idea of net zero and carbon neutral, like the terms of net zero and carbon neutral, and how they just really aren't defined in any like tangible or like consistent way. And so it's almost like they aren't necessarily being helpful. And like it's really difficult to then gauge like which companies are actually doing um, what we want in terms of sustainability and which ones are kind of lagging behind. And with the idea of being carbon neutral, you could be offsetting your emissions by, let's say, like reforesting in an area, um, like far away from what you're doing. But that could be creating a carbon sink that isn't biodiverse and isn't actually beneficial to the surrounding environment or to the people who live wherever this forest is being built. And so like you could be performing this carbon offsetting or like technically be carbon neutral, but it might actually be damaging to people that like you can't even see, or like to habitats. And that's something that I think a lot of people don't think about, is like the idea of kind of having solutions that encompass all parts of this like in these environmental issues, instead of just necessarily like getting to net zero, becoming carbon neutral, because there's so many other facets in like society and on the planet. And then another point I thought about was your point about whether or not we have enough time, which I think is a big thing in sustainability and in like climate change discourse in general, where like, oh, we don't like it's looking more and more likely that we're gonna, surpass the 2-degree mark. And it's like it's obviously very scary to a lot of people when it's put like that. And I think I don't know, the idea of like running out of time obviously isn't being like a great incentive. And I feel like we have to kind of detach from the idea of like these specific deadlines and specific time goals, because they actually really aren't conducive to like making change. Like if you have a deadline, a carbon target for 2030, you could be emitting as much as you want if you assume that you can perform some miraculous like carbon neutrality practice like just before you hit the 2030 mark. And that's that's not really what we want in terms of like a sustainable world. We want to be like gradually working towards these things, and we want to constantly be improving. And I feel like these um dates and like these specific time frames are just like not really helpful in that sense. So yeah, that's kind of almost a question to you guys, whether you think uh governments even should be like setting targets so far in the future. Maybe they should be, I don't know, like setting like smaller targets that push people to make changes like at a faster rate, but smaller changes, um, and things that actually benefit like the rest of society and kind of improve the local environments and things like that. Um, so yeah, those were like a couple of the points that I thought of while everyone else was talking about.
I think what I'd also just add on to that is, and putting my pessimistic hat on as Kai wanted me to, there are pathways that we can take. There are different pathway structures. We've got like the SSP pathways. We've got the NGFS pathways. These are all laid out pathways of possible ways we can transition or not transition. The core feature among them is that some change will occur, whether we have an orderly transition where we start making sustainable decisions early to orderly transition to the new normal, or we do, as Zanna was sort of leading to, was we don't change anything and then we make some drastic changes at the last minute. So that would be a disorderly transition. Or we go full force into the fossil fuels and rely on carbon capture technologies and new technologies to offset those emissions. And so the thing is that the transition will occur. It will look different depending on which pathways we take. And so it's not a matter of will we meet our, what will we end up being a sustainable planet? Will we not? It will happen. And it's actually how it happens that is the most important part. And what's left with society at the end of that transition is really what's important to us. We don't care whether we hit the 2 degrees or whether we whether we undershoot it or overshoot it. What we're actually interested in is what society looks like at the end of that. And that is the really important bit of actually the journey is far more important than the destination. And so I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that we will transition regardless. But if we want a somewhat cohesive and fair society coming out of that, then we do need to be looking towards transitioning early and being active and being ambitious.
I think a lot of this comes back to like what is success in terms of like a sustainable transition kind of setting. I mean, I think a lot of governments and the world is very reactionary with these things. Oh, temperatures are going up. Let's make a goal to reduce temperatures by this much, reduce CO2 by this much. But fundamentally, it can be very short-sighted. We need some form of like, and there is, but we need better international committee that agrees upon what the success look like in the future. I think people are generally very good at working towards a set goal, but it's agreeing on that goal and knowing where we're going. And I think there's something fundamental about most human beings where we sort of have an idea that most people do agree on what a sustainable world is, but that needs to be solidified and then broken down into smaller parts. And, that's the kind of pathway idea, but it can't be as short-sighted as this is the problem that we have created. Now we fix it. It needs to be, this is where we're going instead, less reactionary and more like creative, more optimistic in a way,
But don't you think that countries which have usually lagged behind in development, like India, like China, would be like suspicious of committees like this? They've already been suspicious of like Paris Climate Agreement. Like they would want to develop and reach a stage where the developed countries are before thinking about sustainability. And how would that hinder like an international committee being founded, being actually able to have an impact, create an impact in sustainability? Like, why would countries like India not want to develop first and not look at sustainability with suspicion because the US and other developed countries have used coal and burned frack as much as possible to develop themselves and now are in a position to think about sustainability?
Yeah, like I think that's one of the big challenges that is like hitting governments and international bodies, is that there are so many countries that are still developing and so many countries that maybe not need to but will want to be using fossil fuels and continuing to like generate profits like at the rate that they're going, so that they can get to where these other countries are. And I mean, that was kind of one of the big things at last year's COP, I think, and probably will be again this year, where like they're trying it's like a very difficult task, but they're trying to mitigate um the request to developing countries of like reducing their carbon emissions, and like trying to figure out how developed countries can contribute to that and be able to like further incentivize other like the developing countries to um, become more sustainable as they go, as opposed to doing what we've done, where we've had like exponential growth and then um, have kind of seen sustainability as an afterthought. And I think like technology will play a huge role in that as well, like trying to incorporate sustainable technologies and um, like energy efficient technologies that won't be as harmful in the long run. And it's about kind of being able to bridge the gap between research that's being done in like developed countries and being able to implement those technologies over in other places. Obviously, very complicated in terms of financial um, incentives and things like that. But yeah, it's a very good point. I'm sure George has something to add.
I was just going to say that I think fundamentally it's exactly as Tanisha said. We need to couple sustainability, climate change to HDI, right, to living standards. So if you're reaching that in one way, you're reaching like sustainability or low carbon emissions, but at the cost of HDI, and then that's not a good thing. But also on the other scale, we're in a globalized world, and climate change is such a global problem that you're forced to look at the world in a holistic sense. You can't look at your own country alone anymore, and that goes both for the developing countries, which have to externalize their effects on the rest of the world, but also developed countries, which have to then invest in the less developed countries to help them with that transition. And I think the best way that the rest of the world can do that is through technology, driving down the cost of this transition for the developing countries, giving a cheap alternative to coal, or, you know, providing technologies. And I think what's really unhelpful is this fracturing of the globalized world, where we are seeing more competition in technology rather than cooperation. And I think that's a critical problem. Countries should be sharing this information rather than becoming more and more competitive in terms of it.
But then, don't you feel that uh, if the world becomes more and more globalized, we are sort of like more Western ideal focused? Like it becomes like the West's problems are the West's problems, but the rest of the world's problems are not the West's problems. There's a glorification of issues faced by the West and an underreporting of issues faced globally. There is the issue of these countries basically being trounced for the development of the West. So, for example, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of news about India and China being the most carbon emitting countries in the world. But if you look at the per capita statistics, countries in the developed world emit far more carbon per capita per person than India and China. So, how would you reconcile issues that these developing countries have about their own national identity, their own ideals, and the need for a global world for more sustainability? Do you think we can approach this in a way which, like, these countries don't feel left out, or these countries can actively contribute and feel a part of this global society?
Actually, this is really relevant because I went to quite a few talks in Cambridge sort of about this, where a lot of our international standards is believed, from the West as a universal morality, but in a sense they're constructed by Western ideals. And I think the one part of it is starting a dialogue of creating a set of rules that's not made purely by the West, but also by the rest of the world. And I think it's sort of strange because a lot of people believe that it's okay that the West are making them because they're making them based off this fundamental morality or ethics that everyone shares. But even though there are fundamental points that everyone does agree upon, I think the manifestation of that is very, circumstantially dependent. And I think you might want the same things, but when you have a trade-offs with other things, it becomes a lot harder. And one of the main justification people tends, at least, what I heard in Cambridge was with defending this code that the West has made is that these are fundamental things, guys. Like we all believe in human rights. But when you look at something like human rights or, these sustainability goals, there's a lot of contradictions within it. When this is a right and this is also a right, which one is the more better right? And that comes down to circumstantial cases. So then circumstances come in. So you do need to hear other people talk, even though we all believe in the same fundamental things. And that's why I think it's just international dialogue and some form of, we're trying to create a better word for like some form of internalized cost and reward to everyone rather than one country coming out on top. And I think that's very hard. And that has to be economically driven because that's the language the world speaks. But that has to be decided somehow.
I'm just going to add a really quick point because I know we have to wrap up. But one of the things that we've been talking about a lot on my course is like indigenous knowledge, and I think and that kind of applies to not just indigenous people, but like local cultures and different people around the world as well. And I think it's unfortunate that it's taken this to kind of get to this point, but the having to deal with climate change and biodiversity issues has actually kind of brought more attention to these people, and like we're finding that some of the best ways to like mitigate like carbon emissions or like improve ecosystems is to turn to these people and like actually ask them, what do you guys do and what like knowledge can you share with us? And it's crazy that it's come to like it's taken this long to like kind of realize that these are the people who like have this connection to nature and to like sustainable practices, and like they like the answers are kind of already there, and like it comes like, down again to like all this international collaboration and being able to give people a platform to like voice their solutions and share them with the rest of the world. And yeah, it's something that's like obviously very challenging in itself, but with like enough of this discussion and like this attention, like it would be like a really great solution.
I think it was like really interesting how Zanna you brought in that talking to Indigenous people at the very end. Like that is something that would be very valuable, I feel, after all of this turmoil of like, can we just only trust what the West pushes, or can we actually like have a global conversation? But as we've talked about, it probably does depend a lot on how we end up having that conversation and like how we approach, because that will cause turmoil as well. But with that, we do have to wrap up this episode. So that's the end of this episode, but we will be back next time. We'll talk about some of your personal backstories and like interests you have and like career aspirations, as well as maybe talking about how we can spread awareness on sustainability just in a little bit more detail. So fascinating stuff. So stay tuned.